What we have in the United States and other Western countries has taken centuries to build up, and it actually doesn't take a lot to destroy that. I think when you live through regime change, and particularly when you are coasting along life and thinking that your government and life is stable, and then things get completely turned upside down, like young Americans don't have that experience and knowledge.
We are joined today on the Daily Signal podcast by Andy No. He's the editor-at-large of the Post Millennial, and he's host of the podcast Things You Should Know. Andy, thank you for being with us today.
It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Well, you've been on the podcast a few times before. It's great to have you back. You have a very interesting story about Antifa and your work covering them. For those who don't know your story, though, can you briefly tell us that?
Yeah, so my main beat is I cover Antifa, and I focus on highlighting their violent extremism in addition to focusing on their acts of violence that happen in the Pacific Northwest and other parts of the U.S. Also shining a light on their ideology. It's a movement and ideology of extreme anarchists and communists, and they are working to actually overthrow the U.S. I mean, that sounds kind of conspiratorial, but if you look at the literature that they disseminate, the literature they use to radicalize prospective members, that is what they are calling for. So they have a grand strategy. It's the violence that we've seen on the streets that have been highlighted because of what happened to me last year is just one part of this Antifa movement.
And can you tell us a little bit about that day, what happened when you were attacked by Antifa and you had to go to the hospital? There was some hemorrhaging, I think. Can you briefly tell us how that went down?
Yes, in June of 2019, now I was beaten by a mob of masked militants, and part of that attack was caught on camera, and it became a viral moment. The video that most people have seen shows the second half of the attack. The first half were multiple punches and blows to my head, and that was likely what caused the traumatic brain injury that I received. Had a brain bleed, and the healing process has been long and at times really challenging. After I was beaten and bloodied and trying to make my way out, then this mob began to throw milkshakes, eggs, and other liquids at my face, and I couldn't even see. It was complete anarchy. Every time I repeat it, it's been 8 months now since it's happened. It's just it's so depressing that this happened in a major American city in downtown, right next to the Central Police Precinct, nearby City Hall. So it's like these buildings that hold these institutions are supposed to represent the rule of law. They're like shells and husks. They're like empty.
When that happened, do you remember seeing any bystanders that looked concerned or called law enforcement or anything like that, or were people pretty disengaged?
What I remember is that those who were not participating in throwing things at me were laughing and cursing at me. I think that whole ordeal just shows me like the animalistic sort of part of people that can really easily manifest, particularly when they believe that they are targeting an enemy who's evil. And they generally believe me to be an evil person, a fascist, somebody who is there to try to get people killed, like these vicious lies, but they believed it, and in their minds that's what justified the violence against me. And if there's any silver lining in what happened, I still haven't had any justice. There hasn't been a single arrest, but the one positive thing, I guess, is that it really has forced into the mainstream consciousness this Antifa movement and the far left in general. We're having to confront that media may tell us that Antifa are anti-fascists fighting on behalf of the marginalized and oppressed, but then the real footage that comes out shows them attacking regular citizens, decent people. attacking them with no mercy, attacking them with the intention to kill them.
So do you see a double standard there versus what's being told in the media about what Antifa is versus what actually happens and what they've been known to do?
The mainstream media, I think the narrative that they put out is not necessarily out of bias, but I think it's out of ignorance. You know, things that Don Lemon or Chris Cuomo said at CNN, for example, referring to Antifa as sort of like comparable to anti-fascists who fought in World War II, like American soldiers, for example. Like that's born out of ignorance. They're not familiar with the views and the positions that Antifa ideologues actually advocate for. I think the media that has done like the most damage has been particularly like websites, you know, Vox, Slate, Vice, Huffington Post, Teen Vogue even. Like these places have been publishing content from contributors who openly espouse support for left-wing political violence.
So we're here talking at CPAC, their 2020 Political Action Conference, and the theme for this year is socialism versus the American dream. Why is this such an important topic to discuss?
It's important to talk now because it's already conservatives are late to discussing this. I mean, it's too bad that this is the topic for 2020 when it should have happened, I think, in the past and focused heavily on over and over, because you look at the polling data on young people's sentiments on socialism and it's majority positive. Like this transformation didn't just happen overnight, and it seems to have pulled the rug from conservatives, and that they completely are kind of unprepared. Like socialism for me is it's personal. My parents escaped the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. They were imprisoned after the regime change in South Vietnam that now put in a communist government. And so they were sent to prison camps, concentration camps, actual concentration camps, not what AOC considers. Subject to intense brainwashing, indoctrination, hard labor, had property, businesses confiscated. And this wasn't just unique to Vietnam, but you have so many examples from the 20th centuries of the horrors of the communist totalitarianism. But there's like an amnesia that has taken root across the West. You don't just see this in the U.S., you see this also in Western Europe, of young people having not just obviously no memory of the Soviet Union, the Cold War, any of that, but like they have a romanticized view. And I think it's because of academia. Of course, then when you have the Democrat frontrunner like Bernie Sanders, who has spent decades singing praises to so-called good things that these communist regimes have done after they achieved the revolution, and yet he never qualified any of that praise with talking about how dissidents were treated, how they were killed. So young people are being told half the story. They're being sold the utopian ideal. And for them, it's all kind of theoretical because they're living in a prosperous society like the U.S. and desiring something else. So it's all theoretical for them. I think America has become a home to so many diaspora communities of people who have escaped communist regimes and socialist countries. These are the voices that need to be amplified, and I regret that the mainstream left is really no longer unified in its opposition to communism.
Are there any stories they have told you about growing up in a socialist country, being imprisoned, and is anything of what they told you, is it vivid to you, stands out to you, and something that you go back to when you hear discussions about why socialism is so great or why we need to adopt policies like Medicare for all?
So last month, Project Veritas released some of these great sting videos of Bernie Sanders staffers in Iowa and some other states saying on camera, when they didn't know they were being recorded, expressing support for things that the Soviet Union did in its treatment of its dissidents. For example, defending the gulags, talking about lining people against the wall who were counter-revolutionaries, praising this evil actions that were done, praising it openly. And then how did the Bernie Sanders campaign respond? They protected these staffers. They weren't fired, and Bernie himself never came out to distance himself from these extremist views. I think, like, when I heard and was watching these videos, you know, growing up, my parents gave me various vignettes of their experiences, really post-75. My mother was a teenager at the time, my father is a young adult. But those few years, from 75 to 79, of living under the communist regime was so traumatic for them. My mother was just a teenager, so she wasn't even punished for her political beliefs. She didn't have any at the time. She was a child. But she and her family were punished because of the social strata that they were a part of. They had business, they had property, which was all confiscated. And they were deemed counter-revolutionaries, people who had so-called exploited the labor of workers to get rich. And therefore they needed to be punished not just by having their property taken away, but sent to labor camps to do hard labors, including her younger siblings the youngest was a 10-year-old boy, you know, putting them in these deplorable conditions and subjecting them not just to hard labor and hunger and starvation, but intensive brainwashing and indoctrination. You know, the text that they were exposed to, the things that they had to memorize and say. So, you know, when I hear Bernie talking about these literacy programs that Cuba implemented and how that, you know, allegedly improved literacy rates, like, well, what kind of materials is he aware of? The materials that the people were being subject to so-called improve their reading skills. It's like, it's all part of the brainwashing project that happened. So I'm disturbed that Marxism is now a mainstream left-wing worldview.
Since your mom did grow up in a socialist country and now she's living in America, living in Oregon, living the American dream, what do you think, if she had the opportunity to tell younger people who might be fascinated with the ideas of socialism and communism, if she had the opportunity to say something about her experience and what that was like to these people, what do you think that might be?
I don't think my mother realizes how bad it is right now, but here's one thing that she told me a lot when I was growing up, that I think this is a lesson that would be valuable for young people like me, is that she taught me to have gratitude for being a U.S. citizen. And I never understood that, right? When you're born and raised in freedom, you can spit on it, that's all you know, that's what it means to be privileged. She always told me, like, Andy, you're so lucky to have been born in the U.S. And, as a child, I was like, what are you talking about? My parents wouldn't buy me these video games that I wanted, whereas my peers had this and that. I was completely foolish. And it wasn't until adulthood that I really understood not just what citizenship means, but what America as an ideal and principles are. And so she would tell young people to send her gratitude, because what we have in the United States and other Western countries has taken centuries to build up, and it actually doesn't take a lot to destroy that. I think when you live through regime change, and particularly when you are coasting along life and thinking that your government and life is stable, and then things get completely turned upside down, like, young Americans don't have that experience and knowledge. The wars are fought in other countries. World War II was long ago, and they're subject to intense indoctrination, I think, through media and academia about they're only presented with the horrors of 20th century fascism and with no counterpoint on the evils of communist totalitarianism.
Well, Andy, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for that perspective, and thank you for joining us again on the Daily Signal podcast.
My pleasure.